Yes. Okay. All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started, everyone? Thank you so much for being here. I want to welcome everybody to our 2020 One Book, One GCC keynote address. We are incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Sophia Umoja Noble with us here today as she discusses her amazing book, Algorithms of Oppression. In a few minutes, GCC librarian Becca Cooling will introduce Dr. Noble. There are a few things, however, I wanted to share with you first. Participants will remain muted during the event. As it's a lecture, we recommend putting your Zoom in speaker view layout. Please note that both captioning and American Sign Language interpreter services are being provided. If you wish, you may pin the video to see the ASL interpreter, and you may select the closed captioning option at the bottom of your screen. You can just click on Show Subtitle. Flex will be provided to those faculty in attendance, and student information will be collected for those providing extra credit. A very brief form will be provided in the chat. Please fill in the information so that we may have an accurate record of those in attendance. The form will be shared about midway through the event and again closer to the end of the event. Dr. Noble has very graciously offered to take a large number of questions toward the end of her talk. Around 1:05 or so, we will start a Q&A. As Dr. Noble is speaking, please feel free to type questions in the chat box. Please include question in front to distinguish it from the comments so that we might make it easier for the moderators to see. I can provide an example for you shortly. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Becca Cooling, who will introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Sophia Umoja Noble. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura, and thank you for all your work on this and for collaborating with the library on the One Book, One GCC for 2020. And of course, thank you, Dr. Noble, for being here with us and giving us the opportunity to engage with your work. On behalf of Glendale Community College, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Sophia Umoja Noble to speak with us this afternoon. Dr. Noble writes that the internet is the most unregulated social experiment of our times. Her book, Algorithms of Oppression, library copy, is a timely choice for the 2020 One Book, One GCC. Its acute analysis of the internet's effect on society couldn't be more relevant to the current mood we are living in, the current moment we are living in. Now that so much of our lives is happening online due to the pandemic, we're working online more, we're socializing online more, we're having Zoom weddings, Zoom baby showers. We're spending too much time on our phones. I know I definitely am. And incredibly, we're also in the midst of a presidential election, which is yet again being compromised by disinformation on the internet, especially social media platforms. And as a society, as we are witnessing and participating in a burgeoning racial justice movement, which is forcing the recognition of the oppression that Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience in America. All of these things together make this a perfect moment for us to examine the effects of the internet on our private lives, on our relationships with each other, and on our communities. Dr. Noble is an associate professor at the University of California, Los Angeles in the Department of Information Studies, where she serves as the co-founder and co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. She also holds appointments in African American Studies and Gender Studies. She's a research associate at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford and has been appointed as a commissioner on the Oxford Commission on AI and Good Governance. She's a board member of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, serving those vulnerable to online harassment. Dr. Noble is regularly quoted for her expertise on issues of algorithmic discrimination and technology bias by national and international press, including The Guardian, the BBC, CNN, Wired Magazine, and the New York Times, and more. Her research focuses on the design of digital media platforms on the internet and their impact on society. Her work is both sociological and interdisciplinary, marking the ways that digital media impacts and intersects with issues of race, gender, culture, and technology. And with that, I warmly welcome Dr. Noble to share her research and insights with us.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Noble? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation. just all the care and thoughtfulness of taking up these issues. I know that, you know, these are really heavy, hard times for all of us. And so I just want to, you know, in addition to saying thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you, I really wish that we could be together. It just seems so unfair when we're all right here in Los Angeles together. But, you know, I also just want to extend, you know, my condolences and my care to people who've been impacted by COVID-19, whether it's through your families or your networks. I know that for our family, we too have lost people or have been profoundly affected by COVID-19. And just that we have to gather this way is really a reminder of the kind of fragility of life and our all the things we take for granted. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some new ideas that have kind of grown since this book came out, because I think that it was a shared reading means that you probably know a lot about the book. So I think sometimes it's more interesting to think about, like, what did this book open up and where is it going and what else is possible. So I want to invite a conversation with you today. If you want to talk about what now or what this week, you know, any of those things, we can do that. And I thought also that some of the, you know, harsher dimensions of the book, where we're talking about kind of racial injustices, you know, maybe today, especially given the kind of crisis in Philadelphia right now, and, you know, this struggle to recognize Black life and its value in the United States, maybe rather than show you some of the more graphic and horrible dimensions of the book, we could kind of talk about the bigger implications of it. So, so all that is just a caveat to say that's kind of how I planned to spend some of our time together. And then really, I want you to feel just completely free to ask. There's no questions that are off limits or that you should feel like you can't put into the conversation. All right. So, you know, when I was writing this book, Algorithms of Oppression, you know, this was the outgrowth of my PhD dissertation from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where I was studying, quite frankly, you know, I was thinking about what do all these new platforms mean for the future of the knowledge of people of color, of indigenous communities, of people who, if they are not indexed into a large search engine, whose knowledge indeed might not even be found. Thinking about kind of the ways in which people are represented in knowledge systems, not just something like a search engine, which I don't think of as a knowledge system at all. I think of as a giant multinational advertising platform, as do others, as does the Department of Justice, who just opened up a case against Google this week. You may have noticed or seen in the headlines. So I was thinking about these tensions between libraries and universities and schools, public libraries, all kinds of places where we learn and seek knowledge, and the way in which the tech industry was really being posed as better than all that, quite frankly, that we don't need, you know, I mean, the kind of horrible running joke among a lot of professors in the kind of, like, I don't know, 2012, 2013, in those years, was hearing provosts at our campuses say things like, what do we need the university library for, the college library for, when we have Google? So, you know, when you hear horrible things like that, or you hear parents, you know, always just over and over, and teachers telling kids to just Google it because somehow the authoritative answers are there, that's when I really knew I had to take seriously talking about and reframing Google on, you know, for what it is as a large scale, again, multinational advertising platform, but also to kind of destabilize this notion that big tech companies are somehow better, more democratic, more fair in their deployments in the public. And this is where, along with kind of a couple of dozen other people of color, LGBTQ scholars and journalists, really, I think led by women of color, quite frankly, uh, we were doing the work of trying to show the harms that were coming from these technology platforms. And, this was like pushing a boulder up a mountain when I first started doing this work around 2010, 11. I mean, when I would say to people that, their algorithmic discrimination is a real thing. We need to care about this. We need to provide the evidence to show the public, what's happening in these spaces. People would say that is impossible, Safia. Algorithms can't discriminate because algorithms are just math, and math can't be racist. And I'm sure some of you have heard that too. So it took a long time to get to the point where here in December of 2018, the Financial Times declares Techlash their word of the year. Now, the Financial Times, if you don't know, I mean, here's a company that, this is the newspaper to the 1%. If you don't know, this is the newspaper of capital. This is like truly, the way in which information is shared that impacts global financial markets. And so for them, who were indeed investors in projects like Cambridge Analytica, to declare the Techlash, something has to really be amiss. So, I thought this was so fascinating, that just as a way to show that over time, when people raise the harms, eventually they cannot be ignored, even in the most powerful of spaces and places. And I think that one of the things I want to share with you, and that I always try to share with students, is that we often think that only powerful people matter. But I will tell you that it's people who are vulnerable, people who are in the margins in our society, who always see the most harmful things and experience the most harmful things, and are truly the people who should be listened to, in my opinion, the most. So this work emanates from looking to see what was happening to people of color in these spaces. Now, from having, read the book or glanced the book, that this work really kicked off by kind of a key study that I wrote about in 2012, which was what happens when you keyword search on the words Black girls. And what happened when you did that search, when I did that search over the course of about 2 or 3 years, and then all the way up through sending the book to press in 2016, is that you were met with almost exclusively pornography or hypersexualized images of Black women and girls. Now, if you clicked into those sites, they were all women over the age of 18, right? Who were kind of agents or actors or participants. But you would never find things about children, Black girl children, on that first page. 80% of the results were hypersexualized pornography kinds of sites. And I, would constantly ask the question, why is this okay that among the most vulnerable in our society, children, girl children, they could never influence the kinds of results that were hitting the first page of Google search results. Now, the unfortunate part, I just gave an interview about an hour ago before this talk, talking about how still to this day, when you do searches on Latina girls and Asian girls, you're also still met with a lot of pornography or kind of hypersexualized imagery. And of course, this is part of a long history of sexual mythologies about women and girls of color in the United States, most of which have been mythologies invented to, justify our exploitation, quite frankly. And so I think all of these things are kind of really important and interesting as a way to kind of open up the conversation about what's at stake. Now, we're days away from the presidential election, so I can't help but want to talk about that because, here we are in California. You can still do same day voting in California if you can still kind of participate in the process. And I want to really encourage people to do that. We've had so many headlines about the harms of algorithms and AI. And we also have propositions on the ballot that are tied to AI and predictive risk assessment scoring. We have, proposition around and I can't tell you how to vote. So I have to tell you that right now because I'm a state employee. I work at UCLA, so I can't tell you how to vote. So no one can ask me any questions about how should I vote on any candidate or any proposition. But I will tell you that there are candidates and there are propositions on the ballot that are profoundly tied to these conversations. So I want you to do a little bit of homework and make sure that you're ready if you haven't already voted. Now, here's what's so crucial about this moment that we're in. Here we are days before this presidential election. And I want to take you back to something that was kind of in the epilogue of the book. So, I know that when academics, this is a secret for you, when scholars write books, we write the whole book we put in the first chapter. And then we kind of break it apart and get more detailed because our assumption is that no one's going to read more than the first chapter of an academic book. So that's like a secret. For you. So in the epilogue of the book, which wasn't in the introduction, or kind of toward the end, I talk about this really interesting result. And what it is here we have the days following the US presidential election in 2016, Google's top news hit, when you did a search on final election results, went to a disinformation site that reported out that Donald Trump had won the popular vote. Now, this is really important because we're days away from this happening again. And so I invite you to kind of watch and see what happens. There will be a lot of disinformation and propaganda that moves through social media. I think we really understand that more profoundly ever since kind of the break of the news about Cambridge Analytica. We have antitrust hearings that have been going on this week. But these kinds of things will be happening, and you might yourself be inclined to use a search engine to verify things that you find in social media. And of course, to me, this is one of the more dangerous dimensions of search and search engines is that people use them like fact checkers. And one of the things that I try to show in Algorithms of Oppression are all the reasons why you should not trust a large-scale advertising platform that can be so easily manipulated by people who are willing to pay the most and by those who have the most technical skill to make it seem as if things that are not true are true, or to propagate mis and disinformation. This is one of the places where I think we have the least amount of attention when we talk about the harms and challenges of big tech, is that, when you're looking for, well, I always like to tell this, because I have to fly back and forth between here and the UK for my work that I do at Oxford. And, listen, if I am heading into Europe, anywhere outside of the UK, and I got to convert our get a British measurement to metric, I need a search engine. You know what I mean? I need to, there's certain things I can't just do in my head. I need a search engine or an app to help me with banal kinds of information. And this is the trick here, is that we are so accustomed to using search for banal kinds of things, like how do I convert from this to that? How do I find the directions from here to there? Things that are seemingly fact-based. But, as soon as we start to ask social dimensions of kind of information, this is where we become incredibly vulnerable as a public to what can happen in search. And so these are the kinds of things that I think are really important. They're especially important for you for next week. I invite you to pay attention to what's happening and the struggle to find reliable resources as we come out of the election season over the next few weeks. Now, when Google has been asked in the past about how it is that their search engines can be so just vulnerable to manipulation, here we have an example. This is a very common kind of like neo-Nazis or white supremacists, white nationalists in varying parts of the world co-opting certain types of keywords and manipulating them to have their kind of racist propaganda show up on the first page. For many, many years, if you did a search on the keywords Jews, you would be, the whole first page would be just kind of littered with Holocaust denial sites, anti-Semitic sites, and even the Anti-Defamation League, you know, when they asked and kind of confronted Google about this, this was a typical type of response from Sergey Brin, one of their co-founders, which, you know, when he's asked about how this can happen, he says that for the company to interfere with the kind of organic results, which is what Google calls these search results, organic results. It's like, it's just what the algorithm gives you. He says that to interfere in that process would be bad technology practice. And then he goes on to say that an important part of our values as a company is that we don't edit the search results. What our algorithms produce, whether we like it or not, are the search results. I think people want to know we have unbiased search results. Now, this is such a disheartening kind of untruth that comes out of different kinds of tech companies. I mean, it's very emblematic of the kinds of, you could catch a same quote like this coming from Mark Zuckerberg about Facebook. Last night I was kind of acting out a little bit on Twitter, and I had a whole thing. I had a tweet about how Mark Zuckerberg, I said, you know, remember when Mark just wanted to make a website that could rank whether women were hot or not, and now he's in charge of democracy. So this is what I'm talking about. I mean, this is just nonsense. And it's also true. So, and then I went on because I couldn't help myself on Twitter, which is where I like to have fun. And I said, you know, it's almost like we could use the phrase to rank hot women the way we use in bed, you know, behind statements that we use. And so people were like posting quotes of Mark Zuckerberg and then adding to rank hot women. And that's actually what Facebook started out as. I know some students are too young to even remember the origin story of Facebook, but it truly was a website that was designed to blatantly, in the most sexist possible way, judge women. Undergrads, it's really, it's sickening. So this idea of the way, kind of the cavalier disposition of tech company leaders to disavow any responsibility for their products and to actually claim that the search results, whether we like it or not, it's kind of like saying gravity is just what it is, whether we like it or not, except that the search result and the search product is of your own making. It's your company product. So see, that's where it falls apart, this idea that no one is responsible for the search results. And I think this is a really important dimension of understanding. You know, the book is about all the evidence of the failures of search, but it also is about this disavowal of responsibility by big tech companies. Now, what's so shocking that these kind of statements can come out in the US in particular is that we know that many countries around the world require moderation of platforms. For example, in the EU, it is illegal, especially in Germany and France, who have more you know, I don't know, thoughtful requirements around hate speech than we do in the United States, where it's against the law, for example, to traffic in anti-Semitism. Now, part of this is because, and hate speech, part of this is because in countries like Germany and France, there's much more of a cultural and political understanding of the relationship between something like hate speech and anti-Semitism, and the way in which racist propaganda was used to enable the Holocaust. So, in the United States, we have a much less of a robust national conversation about the relationship between racist propaganda and the crimes against humanity that have happened in the U.S. and in the occupied territories. So I think these are the kinds of things that we want to be incredibly mindful of, is that there is no such thing as kind of neutral results, or that the technology just does what it does and that it's just math or it's just the algorithm. In fact, the algorithm is often human beings who are actively engaged. And this is where I would just draw attention to my colleague, Sarah Roberts at UCLA, her important book, Behind the Screen in the Shadows of Social Media, and Mary Gray and their work, their new book, Ghost Work, which really, again, talk about the kind of hidden dimensions of content moderation and harmful work that tech workers do, who aren't the kind of glamorous white collar tech workers that we're used to thinking about. Now, one thing I'll just say is that as we try to think through these challenges, many people are trying to mitigate the harms of big tech by thinking about new apps and new technology. And there's a whole new field now called AI and ethics, where people are interested in like making better algorithms. And one of the things I really try to implore in the book for readers to understand is that social inequality is not going to be solved, tapping on a piece of glass. That's just not how that works. So, I think it's important for us to think about the ways in which people are responding to the harms of big tech companies. And that includes workers who are organizing and saying, we won't put our skills in service of harmful technologies. We've seen this in terms of Microsoft workers refusing to work on Department of Defense technologies. We've seen Google workers walk out, unwilling to participate in what they feel is the use of their technologies that can be used for warfare and other kinds of surveillance that they are not, that they don't want to see exist in the world. They certainly don't want to be a part of making them. We see Amazon workers who are organizing against unfair wages and exploitive wage disparities at their companies. So there are many ways in which the issues that I try to bring forward in the book are being, we are kind of attempting to address them through public policy, through worker organizing, and through kind of counterculture making, like, again, getting new narratives in play. I've written about this, more recently for Noema magazine, and really thinking about kind of what we're losing to big tech. And of course, COVID-19 has laid bare how fragile our systems are, our educational systems, our public health systems, our public media systems. The only sector that is making money hand over fist, billions of dollars, quite frankly, during this time is the tech sector. It's almost as if they've weakened all of our systems, our democratic institutional counterweights, by not paying taxes, by offshoring their profits, by skimming the cream of the crop of some of the best graduates from our colleges and universities, hiring them into their companies. And then people who could also be doing amazing work in kind of public service and other kinds of careers. And then paying nothing back into the system that indeed produces the workers and the consumers for their products. And of course, it goes without saying that many of these companies are printing trillions of dollars off of racist propaganda, calls for genocide, the weaponization of their platforms for far-right leaning causes, and things that are actually incredibly scary violations of civil and human rights around the world, not just in the US. And so we have to ask ourselves, what it is that we're losing as these companies kind of create the conditions of vulnerability for us and then rush in with their products and services to solve these problems. And this, of course, is something we've seen powerfully in the UC system, where we are now down to about 4% public funding support in the UC system. The UC system, of course, I know many of you are transferring into the UC system when you finish. And, thinking about the rising rate of tuition and how expensive it is now to get an education in California in the CSU and UC systems. And part of that has to do with the fact that this entire sector, I mean, here we are, embedded next to Silicon Beach and Silicon Valley. And none of the largesse of the profits that we have been so deeply implicated in helping make for these companies comes back into the systems to help Californians. And I just find this to be incredibly, just criminal. It's just grossly unfair. And where the subsidy goes to educate people who go to work in this sector, it comes directly out of the parents. It comes directly out of the students. It comes out of our struggles. I mean, we have students who are so much more vulnerable today than they were 30 years ago, 20 years ago, when many of us were getting our education. I cannot believe the normalization that I see of like food pantries and emergency housing for students in California. It makes me ill to think about. And of course, this doesn't have to be this way when you have a booming industry here in California that has to take responsibility, quite frankly, for the way in which it doesn't pay taxes back into the system of the very people it is extracting data from every single day through our use of their applications and their technologies. In fact, are being forced in many cases to use them, whether we want to or not. So, I've been trying to shine a light on these issues. I don't know, 2 weeks ago, I did this event with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, which was unbelievable. I don't even know what's going on. I mean, what? So we can talk about that if you want, but this was in relationship to this new film coming out called The Social Dilemma, which some of you might be familiar with. This is Tristan Harris, who's a protagonist of it. That film has been met with a lot of backlash because, again, many of the kind of reformed tech workers who discovered that there was harm happening by the big tech sector in the last couple of years, failed to read the work of all of the women and the women of color and the people of color who had already been talking about that for 15 years. So we see what's happened there. And, it's been interesting to see the filmmakers and others who have been connected to bring in more people of color, more scholars of color, and more of us who were not in that film, but using kind of the light that film has opened up. One of the things that I've said, even with all the critique of the film, is that it's a really important opening. We need 50 more films, 50 more books, graphic novels, kids' cartoons, all the things, because there's so many things to talk about and educate around. And so this was just a fun thing that where we did that in this series that Meghan and Harry did with a number of really important critics of the tech sector. It's worth a watch for a couple of hours. Just throw it on while you're doing whatever and watch. And there's some really important thinkers that are in this kind of 2-hour series. And this was just a little blip of it. So I guess the last thing I'll say is, we had this promise that the data and the technology was going to save us. This was the mantra of Silicon Valley, that the internet would be the great equalizer, that the data would liberate us, there would be more fairness, we'd be free from the biases of human beings. And of course, what we have is more data and technology than ever, and more social, political, and economic inequality and injustice to go with it. Indeed, I think the data and technology is making it so difficult, so much more difficult to intervene upon discrimination, racism, sexism, that we have to figure out the degree to which not only is a lot of snake oil software being sold to the public, but every year that we've been keeping results on global inequality, each year eclipses the last year. So we have to ask ourselves, are these technologies really solving global social inequality, racial injustice, or are they deeply implicated, profoundly connected to those deepening divides? There was a UK House of Lords study that said they project that by the year 2030, which is 10 years from now, gonna come up quick. Trust, the last 10 went by really fast. They project that by 2030, the top 1% will own 2/3 of the world's wealth. Now, I think that the sector to pay attention to in those transfers of wealth is the tech sector, that is facilitating through financial technologies and other kinds of technologies these transfers, and and again, deepening the divides. So this is not a happy note to end on, but I will say that the one great thing is that we're able to have these conversations so much more easily in the public and in our classrooms than we could have before. When I was first proposing this book to NYU Press, I said, I want to call the book Algorithms of Oppression. And my editor said, this is back in 2012, 2013. And my editor said, there's no way we're going to call it that because no one knows what an algorithm is. And, that's just so hilarious to me now, right? So that's progress in that we're able to apprehend some of these terms and they actually have social meaning, so much greater than kind of their mathematical meaning, right? Or their kind of contextual meaning in software engineering. So, people are all about algorithms of joy and all these kind of interesting ways of thinking about algorithms as a cultural artifact too. So maybe I'll leave it here and just say that hopefully this is enough provocation for us to get a great conversation going about some of the things that you care about too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Noble. That was very, a lot there, right? There's a lot to talk about.
Yes.
Yeah, so we do have some questions in the chat, but I think I'm going to kick it off with this one because you kind of mentioned this a little bit, that today we think of the internet as just like this normal thing, right? We don't really question it. And it did have pretty utopian kind of ideas in the beginning, right? Of improving democracy, of not being evil. But now you look around and it's kind of like this giant hellscape of surveillance capitalism and hate groups. And the internet can be like a terrible place. So what went wrong? Was there a moment in time? How did we get here? What was there ever a possible alternative? It's just hard to imagine where we are right now that things could have been different. But I know that's the work that you do, is imagining how things could be different. Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. So it's true that the kind of libertarian ideal of the internet in the early days was that the internet, this is the kind of John Perry Barlow version of the internet, is that it would be a kind of borderless, raceless, classless, genderless space where everyone could be free. This was during the text-based internet, right? So kind of the web 1.0, and some of us on this call are old enough to have been on the internet before the graphic user interface. And, in that text-based world, people imagined that that text-based world would free them. Now, of course, this was a fantasy because, it's a fantasy imagined by, assumptions that everyone speaks English, that place or space couldn't be known, when of course it could be, and increasingly mattered. You're in a different time zone, you're responding differently. I mean, there were just so many dimensions of like how a narrow worldview about how the world works and who is in the world really informed that kind of the early days of the internet. And people started writing as we moved into a kind of an environment post graphic user interface, where images could start to be processed. Storage became much more robust. Processing speeds and computing power was increasing. I mean, there were so many different developments in hardware and software, bandwidth, that the internet changed, and identity became a huge marker and feature of the internet. So some of us remember platforms like Black Planet or Mi Gente or Planet Out, which were spaces where people could build community around shared identities. So we've had these moments where the possibility for connection was really strong and powerful. But then, of course, capitalism being the primary kind of like, capital seeking new markets to exploit. What we found is that many of those platforms and the online experience changed into, what my colleague Mark Andrejevic calls digital enclosures, where people were data mined to sell to advertisers, right? And that model really came into existence very strong in by the late 90s, early 2000s. So we've had these moments of possibility where there still was harm enacted. I mean, if you read the early work of people like Lisa Nakamura talking about like cyber types, drop down menus, the ways in which people get characterized in websites and are able to find each other. It's just such a different world than the kind of internet we experience today. So there have been people writing about online harassment, misidentification. Women have always been kind of stalked and vulnerable in these platforms in different ways. But now, of course, we're living in a moment where these larger platforms that we're used to, Facebook, Google, YouTube, these are like extensions of the state. So when you look, for example, at how so much data can be collected on you in Facebook and just immediately transferred to law enforcement, or immediately transferred to the government. And of course, this has huge implications depending on who you are, both in the United States or in other countries. And the threat that is to speech, all the while kind of encouraging us to use these platforms for activism, for freedom of expression, and of course, people facing dire consequences for using these platforms in this way, depending on where they are in the world. There's no doubt that the current environment, we looked at Cambridge Analytica, for example, people were horrified, I guess, at the thought of being psychographically and demographically profiled and manipulated and voter suppressed. But that's the entire model now of the internet, which is the thousands and thousands and thousands of companies all over the world that are buying and selling data about us and making data profiles about us and requiring all of our kind of digital identity markers in order to participate with them. So much so that most of us have no idea what our digital profile is and could never intervene upon it. And I think that's incredibly dangerous, not just for our privacy, but for our freedom of movement. We see people not being allowed to cross borders because of their social media activity. We see people being denied loans because of people in their social network not having credit. We see social scoring systems all over the world being enacted, including, kind of built on our own credit scoring model here in the United States. We see predictive analytics denying people opportunities to go to college. So these things are really incredibly dangerous, unregulated, and need a tremendous amount of oversight, if not outlawing.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Noble. We have so many questions coming in. Clearly, this might be something that we'll have to be doing again in the future, but we do have time for several more questions, and we really thank you for your time. One student actually sent me a question in private that I thought was really lovely. She said, or they say, "We are studying your book in my English class, and I really loved the story you told about the searches you made for your daughter and her cousins in order to engage them in conversation. You wrote, the best information is listed by rank in search results was certainly not the best information for me or for the children I love. For whom then was this best information and who decides? What were the profits and other motives driving this information to the top of the results? And how had the notions of neutrality in information ranking and retrieval gone so sideways as to be perhaps one of the worst examples of racist and sexist classification of Black women in the digital age, yet remain so unexamined and without public critique?
Yeah.
Can you please discuss what broader social consequences could then be for our women of color and for our society in general? And what does this then do for humanity?"
Well, it's true that, to me, what I don't want is to have customized search results that are just for me. What I want is a place where we can disambiguate facts from fiction, advertising from research, to really make sense of the broad knowledge and information landscape. In the case of a commercial search engine, you can only imagine that the imagined user is somebody who's looking for porn, because you don't have to add the words porn or sex to Black girls back then when I was doing this work, or, today you don't have to add it to Asian girls or Latina girls. So we become a proxy, a shorthand for pornography, for an imagined user base that is looking to that is so much more valuable than Latina girls or Asian girls or Black girls to the search engine, right? To the profit making. And what that tells you is that the porn industry pays a lot more money to optimize their content in relationship to these keywords. And that means if they're paying more money to optimize, Google's making more money from making it visible. Okay, so that's how that works. And this is one of the reasons why I try to spend time unpacking how AdWords works, for example, because I think people really don't know how search engines work, and it's helpful for people to understand that. What that also means then is, could there be many places and spaces for meeting our information needs? One of the challenges, for example, of where there's good, reliable evidence-based research that might be relevant for different kinds of people in the world are academic libraries. But most of that research is behind a paywall. So if you're not a student, faculty, or staff member, you can't access it. So that's a challenge for democracy, is that if we lock all the research away behind a paywall, and it's not free and accessible like the open internet, then we have a problem. We have a kind of a real crisis there of having evidence-based knowledge flowing freely in our society. We also have, of course, all these acculturating practices that have people think that a search engine is just like a super reliable space to go to. So that, I've tried to already address that. So I think, many times the imagined users is just kind of like uncritically examined. And, I think one of the things that I try to say is, what if we had 100 different search engines? and we understood them for specialization of the kind of content that they focus on? What if we had different kinds of interfaces that didn't just have a page rank from 1 to a million plus of results? Because of course, in that the cultural paradigm is that, you know, to rank number 1 is to be the best. There's no one you're going to convince that to be ranked number 1 is the worst, except for maybe like in some like indigenous epistemologies where there might be some different way of organizing and ordering, right? It mostly in the kind of global north or in the west, this is, we think to be number 1 is to be the most important. So the interface of ranking is you know, it's not helpful. So I think those are some of the kinds of things that we can think about, ways to intervene and make space for, you know, making sense of the information environment. The most dangerous thing to me right now is that it's very difficult for people to disambiguate between fact and fiction, between propaganda and truth. And that has been fully enabled and taught to the public by big tech. No question.
Wow, thank you. I just want to take a second
That's
to
a
remind.
full answer.
Sorry, what was that? I didn't mean to cut you off. Okay.
No, I was just saying, I hope that's a full answer. It was a really long question, so if
Yeah.
not, send it to me and I'll.
I just want to remind everyone on the call that the library has purchased an unlimited access ebook of Dr. Noble's book. So if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, you can read it from the library for free online. And I put the link in the chat so that you can access it. Okay, and we have another question from the chat. What are your thoughts on Facebook's recent move toward upholding democracy, specifically the spread of misinformation and disinformation and ads on their platform? You talked about it a little bit already, but.
Well, you know, I'm on this Real Facebook Oversight Board, which is a group of critics, scholars, journalists, activists who have been talking about the harms of big tech for a really long time. And we call ourselves the Real Facebook Oversight Board. We are not the Facebook Oversight Board, which is the oversight board that Facebook appointed after the 2016 presidential election because of the disinformation and propaganda that was moving through, which quite frankly is as bad, if not worse, for the 2020 election. And so we kind of, as a publicity stunt, because I told you we like to act up on Twitter and just have fun, we have this Real Facebook Oversight Board. And one of the things that we called for was just like a you know, immediate action, which I think these kinds of things that they are implementing right now are in response to the very big publicity stunts and pressure that we've been trying to put on Facebook. They had never convened their own Facebook Oversight Board. We finally, by our convening the fake one, the real one, we put enough pressure on them to make that body finally convene, even though it had been appointed for 2 years. So, you know, it's like, it's a little too late, unfortunately. I mean, I guess we should have started putting the pressure on even harder in this way. I mean, we were just trying to use public embarrassment to get them to take action around disinformation that's moving through their platforms. And if you want to kind of stay on top of this in real time, you can go to the Real Facebook Oversight Board on Twitter. There's a number of like press conferences that we've done and events where we're talking about and sharing the latest research. We did one last week, myself, Professor Ruha Benjamin, who has an amazing book called Race After Technology. He's a professor at Princeton. Another colleague, Dr. Shireen Mitchell. And we, you know, work to share with our colleagues who are doing really amazing, groundbreaking research in real time on the profound amount of propaganda that's moving through Facebook right now to really throw this presidential election, quite frankly. So I would say, you know, what do I think about what Facebook's doing right now? It's too little and it's way too late. I'm concerned. I'm also as concerned about the presidential election as I am the active organizing of militias who are engaging in voter intimidation and who might, in fact, turn harm toward immigrant communities, communities of color, and vulnerable people in their cities around the country, which we already see Facebook has been a huge platform for helping them to mobilize. So I'm very, very worried about that if the election results are not the results they're looking for.
Agreed. You're not alone in your worry there. So I've been taking notes of the books that you've been mentioning and the Twitter accounts. So the guide that I posted in the chat, I'm definitely going to be adding those links for further reading for students and faculty who want to read more. We do have Race After Technology in the library, so that's been added. We have The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which I kind of assumed would be is relevant. Yeah. But Laura, do you want to? We're at 2 minutes till. Do you want to ask kind of a wrapping it up? Where do we go from here?
Absolutely. And that really is the question. So where do we go from here? Since we know that platforms can't really monitor their actions properly, how do we, I suppose, as a society then intervene to make sure that the tech industries are really being properly regulated?
Okay, well, we are working really hard to make the research visible to policymakers. And of course, again, I'm a researcher, I'm not a policymaker. I am not in a position necessarily to, vote. I can't vote on legislation directly in Congress. But I do think that constituents are really important voices. You'd be surprised how much representatives respond to calls that come in, forcing them to take up, certain types of issues. So I think everybody, just as your own exercise, learning how to call your state and federal representatives is just like, it's like a fun thing to do because like, who cares? You can just call them and say, why aren't you, regulating these harms of big tech? You can do that. It's a good thing to practice. I mean, by the time most of my girlfriends who are in their 70s, like that's their full-time job is they're just like calling, representatives. So that's like a good part of growing older is that you get really into that kind of thing. So, do those things, get experience with that, join organizations. Here in LA, we have an amazing group, Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, that does research and tracks like the most harmful dimensions of surveillance by LAPD on vulnerable people. They really they have a great website and you can get involved, you can support. They always need volunteers. I think there are so many, depending on like your own temperament, I would just say, with maybe like for you, just calling a representative is like, whoa, way out there. Maybe for you, you're like, I need to be in the action and I want to get involved like an activist, and you can find, ways to get involved. There are many, many places, and I would just say, you don't have to be a deep subject matter expert. You don't have to become a coder to fix it. You can be a voter, you can be a thinker, a learner, a critical thinker. You have a lot of careers and a lot of opportunities ahead of you. Many of us have many careers over the course of our lives. And so think about how you're going to be a critical thinker, and you're not going to cede all of your power to systems that are opaque to you, that you don't understand and that you can't intervene upon. That's what we're trying to do here, is say, it's interesting that at the moment we passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and we have a modicum of involvement of people of color and women in decision-making positions in society. Boom, all of a sudden we have the rise in believing that computers can make better decisions than people. Coincidence? I think not. So I'm saying that we have to always struggle and remember that our freedom isn't free. Civil rights are not anything we can take for granted. We're actually, we've witnessed a huge rollback in civil rights over the last 4 years. So we have to take seriously this world that we live in, because so many of these things will affect the kinds of futures that we want to have. And I think that you can make art, you can use your voice, you can have all the uncomfortable conversations at Thanksgiving with your family this year. Whatever the things are, wherever you are in your own life is exactly where you should be doing your work.
Thank you, Dr. Noble. That's very heartening. That's a heartening note to end on. I think also it's just a lot. I think people are kind of, you learn all this about Google, you read the book, and then you go and use Google again. You know what I mean? You kind of want an alternative, like what else do I do? But I think, and I would love for you to comment on, although we're really almost out of time, but I think just being aware of this, right? So many people don't even know that this is a problem. So we're already taking a step right now that you're learning about it. And when you do interact with Google, which you inevitably will, you can be more critical, right? Using kind of critical information literacy competency skills to kind of evaluate and be critical about the information that you find. Yeah.
I mean, I'm starting in the library and I'm just so proud. You know, I come out of the field of library science. You see my colleague Aisha here. You know, there's so many smart people in the library, quite frankly, who can put you on a pathway, you know, deepen your own explorations, you know, resist the urge to be acculturated to instant knowledge and instant gratification. You know, we go to college because learning is complex and it takes time, and we have to have many points of view and we have to refine. If not, no one would go to college. We'd all just sit around with a smartphone and use that to make our way through life. That doesn't even make sense. So we know that there's some value to what's happening. And I would just say you have such amazing people right here. I mean, I'm just so, you know, grateful to have gotten my own education alongside librarians and information scientists. And you have so many brilliant ones right here on this call that there's no better place, quite frankly, than to get started with them.
Thank you, Dr. Noble. I hope that doesn't seem like I was like fishing for a compliment for librarians, but
I mean, I wrote a whole chapter of the book about librarians, so you don't have to really fish. I mean, I'm championing a field that I think is so valuable, and that if we don't really tap and you know, get energized with, you know, we might lose. I mean, can you imagine losing the field of librarianship to search? I mean, that's just a horrible thought to me, but, you know, there's no reason to think that it's not possible. And so many of us grew up in libraries. You know, just, you know, think about how important space to think is, and to have guides along the way. Professors, your teachers, you know, all of us are kind of in this together. And I think there's enough provocation here in this talk, hopefully, for you to feel energized, to have many different pathways to follow in developing your critical thinking here.
Wonderful. That's a great note to end on. So with that, thank you so much, Dr. Noble. You've given us a lot to think about. We all have access to your book, so I'm sure we're going to be poring over it and integrating it into our curriculum over the semester. And yeah, we will compile all the literature and references that you made and put that on the library site for folks that are interested in going deeper.
Awesome. Wishing you all the best. Have a great rest of the year. Get out and vote. Get your friends to vote. It does matter. Do it. That's one way that you can resist, is to not be cynical. Okay. And it was great being with you all today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Noble. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.